Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be joining all of you fantastic people on this webinar series, which has become basically a show called Inspiring Insights. And I'm your host, Erin. I definitely am so happy to be a part of lifting the voices of other self-identified women up in the wellness community. And our goal here is to really bring, like I said, bring those voices up and out from the woodwork, because I believe that women have a lot of great things to say. And we host amazing practitioners on this platform. And our hope is that, you know, in doing so, we can shine a spotlight on some folks that are really doing great work in our field, in the alternative wellness industry, and really to help you kind of navigate that system as you go forward and start your own healthcare journey. So if you're tuning in after the fact, drop a little wave into the comments below. Love to see and feel you and feel your energy here. And I wanted to actually start with a land acknowledgement. If you can just give me a moment to do that, Dr. Cyndi, and then I'll introduce you.
Great.
Okay, so the Inspiring Insights show is recorded on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee. We also wish to acknowledge any other nations who cared for this land, acknowledged and unacknowledged. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, and that was an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. So this territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties as well. And with respect, we honor the privilege that we have to do the work that we do on this land today. And with that said, I want to introduce Dr. Cyndi Gilbert. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Cyndi.
Thanks so much for having me. I always start with a land acknowledgement, so it's always lovely to kind of hear somebody else's version of it. You know, I think it's so, for me, I always like try and think through my personal relationship to the land as like, you know, and that's part of, I mean, the unlearning piece that we're going to talk about today really is, you know, that like many, I think many of us, I am a settler to this place. My family settled here, actually, like escaping persecution. And so my gratitude in the people who have, you know, allowed for that space for us, for me to settle here and to live and work here. And, you know, to feel that privilege of having experienced and grown up in a space where that doesn't happen to me, but also acknowledging that like disproportionately the Indigenous folks who you mentioned, whose territories either acknowledged or unacknowledged, you know, that we're living and working on. I too am in Toronto, that they may not actually experience the same feeling of connection and safety and feeling like held in space and feel of wellness, and because of land dispossession that continues to be ongoing. And so, you know, it's important for me and in my work to share in that acknowledgement and also to commit myself to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, especially as they regard, you know, as they apply to health and education, since we're kind of doing a little bit of both today.
And thank you for that addition. Especially it's important to put your own spin on it and how that really impacts you and the people that you work with, right? I really appreciate that. Thanks, Dr. Cyndi.
Thank you.
So I will go ahead and I guess your bio is huge, by the way, and that's amazing. So I'll start from what I have, and
you really don't need to read it all out.
Well, I want to touch on a few good points, which is, okay, maybe the first thing is that you're a naturopathic doctor here in Ontario, licensed, and you are an author of several books, but one in particular, which is called Forest Bathing, Discovering Health and Happiness Through the Japanese Practice of Shirin Yoku. And that's available wherever books are sold. And I really appreciate you writing that book, because I have read parts of it. And as a naturopathic student and a lifelong learner, it really gave me some good insight to what nature has to offer. Mm. And besides that, you have over 12 years of experience working with patients from marginalized and or vulnerable populations. So that includes, like you mentioned, the Indigenous and racialized populations here in Toronto, people who are homeless or street involved, people living with complex mental health issues, people who use drugs, people living with disabilities, the queer, LGBTQSIA, and two-spirited populations, and the people that are living in poverty. So I really appreciate the work that you do. And Dr. Cyndi and I actually know each other through, she was the one who kind of organized the cultural competency training for naturopathic students at my school when I was going through the program. And I, for one, couldn't believe that it was the first time a lot of us were doing that training. And albeit it was there, it was us going into fourth year. Why isn't this introduced earlier years? But there's a whole lot of other logistics beyond that, and I appreciated it for when it did come up. Also, Dr. Cyndi, you're the founder and the co-chair of the Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity and Advocacy Committee, right, at the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine. So you've done a lot of work in that area, and you also sit on the board of the Directors of Ontario of Association of Naturopathic Doctors, right?
I do right now, yeah.
Amazing. So you're doing a lot.
I love to volunteer. That's the real answer.
Hey, it's your service to the world, and I really appreciate that. And I can't wait to dive into that more.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's really exciting. I mean, I think it really, all of that really ties together for me in terms of, having kind of grown up in queer community and the ways in which that has, that lived experience that I think many people come into anything that they're doing with, whether it's because of experiences as a person of color or having been racialized in communities or living with disabilities, or have other ways of engaging with on a very real basis, these kinds of social determinants of health, that just has, it would be impossible not to bring that into my work in every way. And, before I was a naturopath, I was a professional activist, mostly doing environmental and social justice work. And so, once I was a bit more settled in my private practice and having a few years of teaching under my belt and other topics, I was like, no, actually, you know what? I need to get back to this piece of me, because that two-sidedness, of connection with the natural world and the forest bathing piece, it comes from that environmental social justice activism side of me that needs to be fed really in many ways. So thank you for inviting me, because this is another piece of that.
Yeah, there's so many different pieces of us that connect to make work, right? And I guess that's really what we're talking about here tonight. We're talking about our relationship with ourselves, and how the bits and pieces kind of fall together in ways that sometimes we may or may not notice our own biases. Sometimes we're not even aware of the language that we use, or, from the institutions that we learn from, how ingrained some discriminative and oppressive, acts and beliefs and all of that kind of just fall into our psyche without even really knowing. So I was curious, maybe we can just start with how, I guess maybe what health equity is for folks that are listening and maybe who haven't heard of the term before.
Yeah. I mean, I think when I think about, equity, I think about all of the related terms, right? And, it's that root of that word equal. But equal equity doesn't mean that everyone gets like the same amount, or that it has to be so much more than that. And when I think about health equity, I'm really thinking about like health inequity and what the opposite of that might look like, because you know, we know this, we're living through it right now on a daily basis. We hear these stories about the ways that some communities are disproportionately affected by COVID. And often those communities are people who work in essential jobs, who are in more precarious work situations, who are racialized, or are recent immigrants or not so recent immigrants, but that really it's more about the social determinants of health. You know, it's not about somebody like me who, you know, is sitting here in my house talking to you and like has a private practice where I can work virtually and I can stay home because that's a privilege too. And that I have a home that I can work from and have this quiet space. And so when I think about health equity, I first think about that inequity, the way that some folks are disproportionately affected by health issues, not just COVID, but, you know, chronic diseases, anything you can possibly name, that, you know, we know that people who might have those experiences of discrimination are more stressors in their life due to social determinants of health and oppression, are inequitably having less access to health, less access to wellness, and poorer health outcomes. And so health equity to me is like talking about all the ways in which we can like upset that balance, or how do we, you know, think through what it would mean for that disproportionate piece to be mitigated or lessened, and what kind of barriers do we need to remove for folks so that you know, and that requires us to like talk to the people who are affected and ask them, like, you know, what do they need, right? And I often tell this story, some people might have heard it before, that like in my first year of practice, I had this question on my intake form that was, you know, what barriers do you like see to reaching your health goals? And I had a patient who wrote down racism and homophobia in that space. And so it wasn't that I hadn't thought about it before, but it really got me thinking like, okay, so now what am I actually going to do about this? How am I like sitting in my office with this person going to, you know, work to, you know, it seems like such a huge thing. Like, how are you going to fix homophobia in the world? How are you going to fix racism in the world?
Right.
But if we start to kind of think about what are the small changes that I can do? What can I like unlearn or learn about this process so that I can start to be part of something that would move us towards health equity, where everyone has access to wellness in the way that they need it. Right.
I mean, there's so much in that, and that's exactly where do you start really is the biggest thing. And I think that's a lot. It's a loaded question, and it's on the forefronts of everyone's minds right now. And because of the situation that 2020 has presented with us, or to us, you know, there is a silver lining to what has happened in terms of just Black Lives Matter, you know, the whole movement really coming to a head and getting seen, is that it offered the space for a lot of people who were really like under quarantine at that time and weren't doing a whole lot else, or didn't have a whole lot else to distract them from what was actually going on. And so they really, and I know a lot of my family, you know, I have, you know, my whole family is white, and we sat down and talked about how racism is really apparent still in the small island that I'm from in Newfoundland, you know, and that's mostly because of exposure. People just don't know folks who are not white, you know. But where do we begin? And in that sense, with the example that you use with that patient, is there something that you could have thought of right away that maybe would have helped that patient, you know, remove a little bit of homophobia from that barrier?
Yeah. And I think, I mean, for me, that part, like the homophobia piece was easy because, it's easy for me having like, in some ways, and I think that like that's something else to talk about, is that like even when we think we have stuff in common with someone culturally, that doesn't mean that that we're not going to mess up or like make mistakes or end up oppressing somebody else accidentally or inadvertently.
Mm-hmm.
But I think my initial reaction was like, okay, but not here. And so and then the step was like, okay, well, what do I do about that, right? How can I, move away from like my lived experience in a sense, right? And not make assumptions based on my own experiences with these words like racism or homophobia, and address this person. So, part of it is just like in that one-on-one kind of approach is like having curiosity about it. Like, what does that mean? Like, how is that? What are the situations of homophobia and racism? Are they more interpersonal? Are they structural? Are they institutional? Where are those barriers happening? And being curious about that and listening to somebody so that, then you can learn from somebody else's experience, but also, figure out, okay, well, how can we work to removing those barriers in some kind of way? Like maybe I need to be more of an advocate for change structurally, right? Which is, you mentioned like the work that I've tried to do at the naturopathic school. And that's a huge part of it for me, is like, there's this piece of institutional oppression that can occur in curriculum and in educational institutions. And the one that you went to and that I still work at isn't like, it's not like that doesn't happen everywhere. It does. Like that's the reality. But how do we start to try and work through this as a community and as individuals? And so there's like that advocacy piece. There's just like raising money and doing grassroots work. There's or supporting other voices and championing other people to do that work, or turning down offers to speak, which I've done, or and recommending other people, which has been one of the things that I've tried to do a lot in 2020. So about half of the requests I get, I suggest somebody else who historically hasn't had that opportunity to have their voice shared or to be the expert in the room. And so, it's thinking through like small ways, and they're just small gestures. They don't add, I'm not going to say like, this is how we're going to end racism, or this is how we're going to end, homophobia or heteronormativity. That's obviously not going to do it. None of these things do. But in that one-on-one, how can we approach each other with kindness? How are we compassionate with one another in our like relationships with ourselves and with others, so that we can grow as human beings? How we can, think through what are the ways we can do things differently. And I think that's the starting place, right? Is that piece that you talked about with your family, is like, okay, I'm going to spend some time doing some learning and self-reflection. Mm-hmm. is the first step.
Yeah. And I think also there's a step, at least for, and I can only speak from my own perspective, but for sometimes when I get called out, or when I feel like that shame for feeling, being a white settler, mm-hmm. a descendant of someone who came here and destroyed a lot of things, including Indigenous culture. There's that sense of reactivity at first. And that's not uncommon for so many folks to experience. And so really just being able to sit with yourself, and maybe even sit with others who also feel that way, and reach out a hand. Mm-hmm. That really helped me, because I did feel reactionary at first. And then it slowly kind of starts to fade until you get to a point where you can say, okay, I'm not in denial anymore. Yeah. I can do something about this now.
And I think that experience like that you're talking about is so important and so different for different people, right? And I think, I mean, my experience is even as someone who's like very white presenting or white passing, most people wouldn't look at me and say, you know, that you might like even have questions like, what do you mean by your family settled here because they were persecuted somewhere else, right? And I did experience very like direct things like having been called ethnic slurs as a child. I had a kid in school more than one occasion throw pennies at my feet because they thought that Jews would like pick up pennies all the time. And I think for me, like the important piece was recognizing that even though I have these experiences that I, you know, can recall very vividly that had a huge impact on me, that, you know, often like when and part of that is age, because when I went to school, they still did the Lord's Prayer in public school, which I'd never heard before I went to public school. I had no idea about. I still to this day have like very little lived experience with Christianity as compared to other religions. And so I certainly had that feeling of being othered in those moments. But at the same time, I know, having grown up in a very like close-knit Jewish community, that the amount of like racism directed at other people really also was a huge part of my experience growing up culturally. And that, you know, it's a different way when somebody, when we start talking about those ways that we might harm other people because of having been socialized in a culture, because we all have to one extent or another, that as somebody with that privilege of skin tone, you know, what is my relationship to that? And what's my relationship to myself? Am I going to turn that inward and like be, you know, feel horrible because I did something wrong and turn that into shame and turn it into guilt? And then that not be, you know, guilt can be productive. It can be, I feel bad and I want to do something differently. But guilt can be like a way of just centering on my own feelings of like having done wrong and ignoring the fact that I actually may have harmed somebody else through that process, or that I could take that again and, you know, think through like, what could I do differently? Do I need to change my language? Do I, you know, need to rethink this entire concept I have of the world, or of a stereotype that I learned as a kid? Or, you know, that how can I take those feelings of reactivity and turn them into response? I think is, you know, exactly what you were talking about. And it does different for different people, right? Like, and a lot of that has to do with our own positionality, right? Like you being, you know, like a descendant of white settlers in Newfoundland is very different than my experience of, even if our families may have, I don't know, but may have come around the same time. But my experience as being like a settler of Jewish immigrants from like the shtetl running away from persecution in Eastern Europe is different, but there also are some similarities in terms of the privilege that we both share now.
Yes, and that's a good point too. And I wanted to not necessarily change the direction, but
do it anyways.
I talk about the kind of the importance of language and inclusivity in particularly spaces that are occupied by women. And it's important to me because, you know, a lot of people I know have fallen through the cracks in both, you know, the allopathic or like westernized model of healthcare, and also the alternative side, you know, and that's probably because it's a little bit more privatized and you kind of have to like jump through hoops, and it's more expensive to pay for that kind of privatized care. So, you know, how important is it? Because we can talk about, we're all, you know, everyone that's tuning in here, I think, is mostly in the GTA, but if someone that I know, you know, back in Eastern Canada, who doesn't necessarily see the importance of changing their language to be more inclusive, or, you know, because they don't have those types of patients coming in through their door, like, why is it necessarily important for everyone to to change and be more inclusive and use more inclusive language?
I mean, I think it's a mistake to think that those patients couldn't come through your door. And that's the biggest thing. You know, it's like when I ask people like, you know, how many, you know, and I look at studies of like asking like healthcare providers, like how many people from the 2S LGBTQIA community do you see, or do you see anybody? It's amazing to me when somebody says like, I don't have any patients, because
Right.
I am always, yeah, that's the face that you make, right? It's like, really? Is that actually true? Or just like that you haven't asked, or that they're not feeling comfortable to disclose, or, you know, what does that mean?
Or they've made an assumption.
Or that you've made an assumption about somebody and they chose not to correct you because that, you know, might evoke some like feelings of not being safe to make that correction, or like 1,000 reasons why nobody would, why someone wouldn't do that. And so if you don't change your language, you're never gonna, you know, in some ways, you're not gonna actually like invite those people to disclose or to be in your practice, or to walk through the door of your like store even, because they're not gonna feel welcome. And so, or included. And I think, you know, when I don't know exactly what you were referring to when you like talked to or introduced this idea, but I was thinking about this earlier today and like posted some, shared a video on my Instagram story about, you know, the ways that we talk about menstrual cycles and periods, and even, you know, like that we make all these assumptions about what kind of people have periods or get periods, or like, and this very like heteropatriarchal, like, and white heteropatriarchal assumption that like womanhood and femininity equals getting your period. And that anyone who falls outside of that then gets excluded. And that's not just about like folks who maybe are like trans men who get periods, or like non-binary women, or non-binary, you know, like men who get periods, but that we are also excluding people who like don't get their periods because they have PCOS, or don't get their periods because they have they have other medical conditions, or because they're postmenopausal, or because, you know, there's so many reasons why somebody, maybe they're taking like a contraceptive method that stops them from having their period. Like there's so many ways that this plays out. And so we end up, if we use like narrow terms, or we use terms that, you know, only attach to like one gender to describe something that affects like all sorts of people, then we're kind of missing out. And I think that to me is the piece, is like, we're not, we're missing a whole bunch of people, and we're making them feel not welcome. And we're not saying like, you belong here. And that's never our intention with language. Like that's not how, like, you know, but language sets boundaries around things. It defines what is and what isn't. And that's, you know, those words that we choose do have a lot of power, and they make a difference to people in very concrete ways and very big ways, even though it might be like as small a word as like a 5-letter word like woman. that you know, it has that impact.
Yeah, that's huge. And just to speak on your point specifically to people who do or do not get periods, and like feeling that it's the same. I just thought of it, you know, and I think you are going to share, or Dr. Cyndi has a thing that I can share later with folks, kind of a PDF saying how to neutralize your medical language in general. And I'm saying this because I know a lot of providers are listening to this right now. And it makes such a difference, you know, when there's somebody sitting in your office who has had cancer in their chest and you call it breast cancer when they don't even consider that they have breasts, right? So just little things like that make such a huge difference to how much care you really give to somebody in that space, you know, in that space when they're feeling so vulnerable already. And, you know, you already are acting as, you know, the kind of like higher up, or like in this power dynamic of being a doctor patient in that relationship. So, there's so much that we can learn that we don't even realize.
Exactly. And I'm going to put that link to that document you're talking about in the chat so that everyone can see it. But yeah, I wrote this actually with a recent naturopathic grad, Arlie Milliard, who I'm super grateful to, and want to ensure that Arlie also gets credit for it, because we couldn't have done it without doing it together. And also some contributions from Kira Leese and a bunch of other folks who aren't named on that document, who kind of looked through it and helped us rethink it. And it to me is like really important, because it goes back to that place of like our relationship to ourselves, right? If we think about it, either way, we're talking about like breasts and chests, or we're talking about periods, that each of us has like a unique relationship to ourselves, just as much as we have a unique relationship to place and to other aspects of our health and our wellness. And it is like about the ways in which we, or healthcare providers, can make assumptions. And it goes back to that health equity piece. Like, what kind of assumptions do we make? Are we making an assumption, if I say breast cancer, that person, what their relationship is, or what to that part of their body, or what they even call that part of their body, as you pointed out, and then, or that process that's going on, or what the repercussions might be, right? For one person, who has been told that they might need to remove that tissue on their chest due to like cancer, say, they might be relieved, and another person might feel a whole bunch of loss. And if we don't ask that person, or if healthcare providers don't provide that kind of question, like, what is your relationship to this piece around your health, then we're doing a disservice to them, because we know that there is so much difference between us in our relationships to ourselves and to those, parts of anatomy, or about our bodily processes. And the same thing goes for periods, right? Somebody who's not getting their period regularly, like, might actually be grateful for that. And somebody else might really want that to be there. And gender or pronouns or people's names or any other marker that we could think of isn't going to tell us that answer about how that person feels.
Yes. And that goes back to the provider really making assumptions or not, and being pretty self-aware, of themselves, like you said, but also of the larger picture and what really impacts people's lives. You could know so much about diagnosing and about all these conditions, or really know, as a specialist, one thing really, really, really well. But if someone comes to you and, has been diagnosed per se, but is actually okay with their diagnosis, what does that look like in terms of your own treatment for them?
Yeah.
Or like the gold standard, or like what you're supposed to tell them, and what you're supposed to chart, and all of that.
I think that goes back to the kind of empowerment of a person in their healthcare too, right? Is like, that requires us to be like aware of what kind of assumptions we might make, and when we're making those assumptions, versus like when we're asking somebody, because they're really the expert in their own body and their own health. They've lived with their body and their health status the longest than anybody who's ever known them, except for maybe perhaps their parents, but they still know it more intimately, and they know what meaning they attach to different things, or what their goals are, or how they want to go about reaching them. And so when we are like more humble, or when practitioners can be more humble about what that might look like, then that's when we are able to create that space for someone, and think of ourselves as like being more like, here's some information. Here's like, here's like, how can I facilitate this process, right? How do I remove this barrier? Just to bring it back full circle, right? How do I help to make this easier?
Yeah, exactly. I love that. there's so much to be said for the type of care that we seek out. And it also, it's a two-way street. There's that healthcare provider who maybe makes those assumptions and doesn't ask questions and isn't curious about you and just kind of does whatever they think is right in their own mind. And then there's also, when we're faced with that, how are we as patients or as clients able to speak out and ask for what we need? And sometimes there's a bit of both. Obviously it's a two-way street, right? So there's so much there that it's really difficult to wrap your head around, also because like I mentioned before, that with that kind of power dynamic, there's almost an assumption from the patient, not always, but a lot of the times, that what the doctor says is correct.
Yeah.
Or right.
Or that it's not okay to make corrections, right? Or that, and maybe it doesn't feel safe to do that, to say actually, I don't agree with that, or I don't feel that way, or I don't want to do it that way. And power and those power dynamics and authority play so much into it. But it is challenging in the sense that, I can think about a situation that a client shared with me where they saw a practitioner and they had seen this practitioner because they had a fungal infection kind of underneath their kind of bra line area, or where one would where that bra line would sit. Mm-hmm. And they went to see this practitioner, and they were, that was their main concern, was how to resolve this fungal infection. And the practitioner did ask them a bunch of questions about, about clothing options. And they didn't actually wear a bra. They were wearing a binder. So for those who may not know, a binder is an item of clothing that's often quite restrictive to try to minimize chest tissue, or to reconfigure chest tissue to change the appearance of of the chest area, and often is quite restrictive and constrictive and very tight. Sometimes people would make a binder out of tensor bandages or out of other tighter clothing items, or items of clothing that are a little bit too small, even. Mm-hmm. And there are actually clothing items that are marketed as binders and for that purpose. Though of course those also cost more money because capitalism. And this client shared with me that this other provider had actually told them, well, the easiest solution is actually to just stop wearing the binder, and the fungal infection will clear up, because there won't be this constant lack of airflow and irritation and potential for sweat, all of which is true. But that recommendation just was inappropriate for that person. It didn't work. It was something that felt unsafe. And didn't meet their goals. That wasn't an option for them to not wear a binder. That created more harm, the idea of that, than the rash itself. Mm-hmm. And so again, it comes back to these assumptions that we make about how do we interact with somebody when we're, when we might have been told there's obviously there's this naturopathic, and often in complementary and alternative health systems, this idea that if you just take away the thing that's causing the problem, then that's the easiest solution. But sometimes that just doesn't work because of personal individual situations. And so we do have to work around that and think through what's causing the most harm to that person, as opposed to just here's the cause of the problem, and so we're just going to take it away.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, that's a really great example to for people who just maybe haven't had experience with folks who wear binders, but there is a lot of health things that may come up because wearing a binder, but you can't like that. You need to ask, like, what are your goals in this situation? And you can't just say like, this is the best thing, because that's not an option for folks sometimes. So yeah. And I'm curious for the people listening, if you have had a certain experience with anything that we're talking about, I would love for you to share that in the comments section, because there's, it's great to kind of just talk about it in theory, but we can, unpack some things and things that happen in real life if you want. Use this space as a space to do that if you feel comfortable. And in the meantime, Dr. Cyndi, I did want to ask, if someone out there is potentially looking for ways to diversify and, unlearn or learn specific things about how to be more inclusive, either within, themselves or within their own clinic, how does one go about doing that?
It's such a huge question. I think like there are lots of people offering like kind of very targeted workshops in different areas. And I think, like the reality is like none of us in this space talking about unlearning wellness or like how to diversify language or practice or like unpack implicit or unconscious bias. We each kind of have our own place of focus. Like, so for, me, it's really around queer issues, certainly more than other aspects of or intersections of oppression. And part of that is just like, that's the space that I come from. That's the kind of cultural place for me and positionality. As someone queer identified, I feel comfortable speaking in that space. And other folks may have other offerings. So I think, if we think about like our own kind of wellness space, there are lots of folks in Toronto doing amazing work. I think of like the Black Health Alliance right away. There's individual people like Tennille Brock, who is a great facilitator and social worker. There's other folks doing all sorts of sessions on like anti-racist, anti-oppression work, which I think is a great starting place for folks. Sophia McCarter, who's also a naturopathic doctor, but out of the States, does consults in this area specifically around anti-racism in naturopathic medicine. I recently sat on a panel discussion and presented with Casey Sutton, who's a recent naturopathic grad, and Tanya Tabar, talking about anti-racism in naturopathic medicine. We're presenting that again in Nova Scotia in a couple of weeks.
Nice.
Yeah. So I think there's lots of people doing and accessing workshops in that space. For folks looking at like anti-Indigenous racism, I always invite them to like look at the work of Joanne McCarthy, who's another naturopathic doctor and has a bunch of YouTube videos online to like help people get started. And again, there's a ton of resources out there, and just getting anything, dipping your toes into it, right? For if folks are really interested in the like queering side of wellness, I do have a couple of courses online. I can stick them in the offers section here, Erin. That that folks who are interested specifically around their like they're making having more queer inclusive language or queer inclusive spaces and creating that specific kind of unlearning, then they can check out that document that we talked about. And then I have a bunch of courses on Thinkific that I shared with folks as well.
Oh, nice. Perfect. I see the offer.
Does that work? Yeah.
So, yeah. So anyone who's viewing this either now or in the future, you can just scroll down in the little menu here below the chat, below polls, you'll see offers. And Dr. Cyndi has put a link there to her courses on Thinkific. Thank you so much for that. And all of that list, I'm going to go back and write it all down and put this in an Instagram post, because that's just, some easy ways to even just go follow folks on your social media, just have more exposure to it. I think that's the biggest thing right now. And beyond that, coming at it from a place of, recognizing your privilege and also feeling comfortable enough to go forward in whatever type of work that you decide on doing, whether that be, vocal activism, or maybe just on a smaller scale, you want to donate some money or ask your friends and family to donate some money to organizations that exist. There's so many different ways. So that's a good thing for me. I'm going to make a list and repost this, and maybe I'll even email everyone out that registered for this webinar about that as well.
Yeah. And I think, that is a great way to get started, is just like follow people, even to kind of make it more part of your daily life, so that you are, thinking through it, or, donating money, as you said, I think is like really critical. When I first launched my courses, I gave half of the profits to the Trans People of Color Project here in Toronto, just, in recognition of like the fact that queer rights would not be where they are today without, in particular, Black trans women. And so, wanting to kind of put my money where my praxis is, and do that, I think is really, really important. And one of the reasons why I still I offer like a scholarship to any QT BIPOC students who want to take those courses on Thinkific is that it's really important to me to like lift up people who otherwise have those barriers in place. Again, trying to like reduce those health inequities wherever possible.
Mm-hmm. And it's so important for us to do that as we go forward, and because we are, like you said, privileged in a lot of ways, and have the privilege to recognize our intersectionality, at least in that way, and make changes. We can make change really on a small scale individually, and those changes can mean such a huge difference for folks, and not just one other person, but several other people. And I know, Dr. Cyndi, your work has done so much of that, and given people hope and given people a way to change, just from within the confines of the naturopathic community. So I really, really appreciate that.
Thanks. Yeah. I think it's so important for us to keep talking about it. Right. And I think that's the piece, is how, it's not just about like Black Lives Matter in that one instance where like everyone was paying attention to, to George Floyd in the moment, or maybe, then everyone's attention turned to Joyce Echaquan, who's the Indigenous woman who recorded her own passing and mistreatment in the hospital in Quebec. And that it's not about these like individual cases, right? That this is something that's an ongoing project, and it's not about, listening to this one talk with us today. As great as that is, it's a commitment, to me, like that commitment I have to reviewing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to actions, or reviewing, my own language. And, we're all going to make mistakes. I'm sure I made like 4 mistakes probably while we were having this talk today. But, that we have that compassion for ourselves and continue to learn and think through. That I think there's like these kind of small pieces, right, about that reflection piece. And then there's these other pieces about things like how do we incorporate it into practice if we're a wellness provider. And so, that form I shared, like the neutralizing clinical languages, does have very like specific examples of like how to shift things, right? I always think about like intake forms, because they're like that first place where people interact with you. Mm-hmm. And there's so many opportunities on those intake forms to change the way that we write about things, that we, stop like using categories like women's health or women's reproductive or female reproductive or whatever words that that we've like subheading a section that really has to do with like people who have a uterus or have ovaries or can get pregnant. And so that we kind of change the framing for ourselves, or that we allow for more blank spaces for people to self-identify, right? I think about, the way I structure intakes forms is the way I was thinking through. There was this form, actually it was like for a summer camp that I had to fill out for one of my kids. And it said, I think there was like a blank for ethnicity. And these are the kinds of things like often confuse me, right? Yeah. Do I put, for myself even sometimes, like, what do I put in that space? Do I put Caucasian? Does that really like exemplify who I am? I mean, is it accurate even? Mm-hmm. And in my case, I can't trace my family back more than 3 generations or 4 generations very well. And so, I don't always have all those answers. And I asked my kid, and my kids actually, my kids are actually, I guess, like biracial or bi-ethnic or multi-ethnic or however you want to write it. And I asked the kid, like, what do you want to write in this space? And one of my kids was just so straight, so like very descriptive, and wanted to put like all the information in. And so was like, okay, well, if they're asking about ethnicity, I'm going to write Ashkenazi Jew / which would be more of my side, and then / South Indian Hindu on the. I was like, wow, you're covering all the bases, being very specific about it, and clear about positionality, right? Mm-hmm. And so that blank space allowed my kid to write in, what made sense for them, and that might not be the same way I would have worded it. If there was a drop-down menu, like, I don't know what they would have chosen. Like, would they have chosen something that said other? I always like think about, nobody wants to be othered. Nobody wants to be the other and like check off that box. That's like, I'm not any of the things named here. I don't even warrant, a category of my own.
I know.
And so, that blank space, it means so much in some ways to that person who often doesn't get a checkbox. And so, and we're never going to put enough checkboxes or enough drop-down menus or enough anything. And so I think, that's one thing. And then I kind of have done away with intake forms myself mostly, but I do always ask clients what their pronouns are. And so I just ask them flat out, like, what pronouns do you use? I ask everybody, I let them know, I ask everybody in my practice. I use my pronouns on my signature in all of my social, like everywhere. I didn't change it here today, which is actually unusual for me, because in every Zoom call, it always says like Cyndi Gilbert, she, her.
Right.
I'm sure there's some way to change the settings on
yeah,
Webinar
I
Jam.
can change that. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
But
I could have asked you beforehand.
Yeah. But I think those are like some of the easy fix ways, is like letting people self-identify and explaining why you're asking, like why you want to collect that information, right? Like, what is the purpose of asking somebody about their ethnicity? Is that, or asking somebody about their pronouns, right? And so, if we're asking about pronouns, like usually it's because I want to know how to refer to you in the third person. If I'm like if I have to write a letter to your doctor, or I'm explaining something, or we're doing role playing, or whatever it is that you're using it for. But in a one-on-one session, we don't even often need that information. So just being clear about why we're asking is really important too, and that kind of expands into like all these other areas, right? Like, what's the main rationale for asking about pelvic organs or reproductive system if somebody doesn't have any concerns in that area? Is it because we're asking about like primary health screening exams? Like we want to know about Pap tests, or we want to know about a prostate exam, or we want to know about a mammogram, that we like are clear about why we're asking about things.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. I mean, before I even moved to Toronto, I had never seen an intake form that asked me my preferred name. Just my like I've never seen, I had never before seen one say name and then your preferred name on it. And I was confused as to why somebody would ask me that. And then now, obviously, you know, years later, I can see that even just after working in some spaces that people don't sometimes don't want to be called by their full name, or they, you know, just don't even recognize that name or their legal name, you know.
Or they go by their second name, or I have other clients who actually use their last name as their first name, and that's what they want to be referred to. And so,
yeah, there's so many different ways.
Yeah, and so it's like it's just like a way of acknowledging, like, again, like, here's this person in front of you, and like, what do you want me to call you? How do you want me to refer to you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that answered your question, Roxanne. I know we didn't really specifically point it out, but you asked.
I did it in a roundabout way.
Totally. Yeah, no, I love it. A lot of ways to incorporate, you know, some neutral language into the practice, including inclusive pronouns on intake forms and those kinds of things. And you mentioned, just as as an aside question that I have for you, Dr. Cyndi,
sure.
How you said you don't use intake forms, so you just kind of use the first appointment as that, or?
I have like a very condensed version. I used to use intake forms a lot more than I do now. And part of that is because I am on an electronic medical record system that I'm not crazy about in terms of the ability to incorporate an intake form or create my own questions, or like have it even say currently. I mean, I fought with, or I encouraged, not fought with, I very strongly encouraged them to include a space in the kind of regular demographic section that had pronouns. And I advocated for that, and that did get changed. So I'm super grateful to them for that. And I also when I initially signed on to use this, I really was very clear that they had a drop-down menu for gender. And their drop-down menu, when I was looking at, and this goes back many years, and I think most systems have adapted more options now. But when I was first, practicing and moving my practice into electronic medical records, all the systems I was considering, they literally had woman. I think it even said it didn't even say woman, it said female, male, other. Which is not how I would ever describe gender. Gender is not female or male or other. None of those actually are genders. So, so the first thing I wanted to do was ask them about changing these drop-down lists. Could I have, if they wanted to keep female, male, and other, I wasn't going to argue about it, but I also gave them a long list of could you please add these to the drop-down menu, because my clients might have all of these other identities. Kind of some social media platforms have done this, where they have 1,000 options. And I'm yeah, that's one way to do it, with a drop down, and then indicate it. But the one thing I would say that most electronic medical record systems don't do great is things like parent guardian language, or things on family history lists, where there's family history is mother, father, and those don't work often for folks who are adopted. It doesn't work for folks who maybe don't know one of or more of their biological parents. It doesn't work for folks who are children who were conceived through assisted reproductive technologies of different sorts, or who may have had a surrogate as part of the process of them coming into the world. There's there's so many different kinds of family constellations that don't get represented by that. And so I had to take out like the entire family history section out of my intake form because of that piece. And people just weren't always like filling out a PDF that I sent them. So I just was like, you know what? I can ask all of these questions in person for the most part. So that's where I've landed most recently.
Yeah.
So I would use one if I had a bit more flexibility again, but that it was also integrated with my EMR.
Exactly. Yeah. No, thank you for allowing me to pick your brain on that one, because it's important. It's important to folks. You know, just as a patient myself, have gone through that. You know, the male female other, and I'm like, like,
Yeah.
who knows? Like,
or even me, like when you ask me, I'm like, I don't know. If I have to fill those forms out, I usually write cis. If I get a blank space, I'm going to write cis-ish. That's actually like what feels closest for me. Or I might just write queer. But because, you know, I guess like part of it is like, you know, gender is such, again, it's like that relationship to ourselves and our whole selves, right? People might look at me and they'd be like, oh, obviously you're a cis woman. And I think we have to really question those things and stop making those assumptions about other people based on, you know, what we perceive about the way that they present in the world. And you know, identity isn't something that always shows on the outside easily, right? And you know, and there's ways that we kind of invisibilize that, or the ways that we might have a sense of gender that's more fluid for some folks, like, you know, that like myself, where like at times in my life, more historically, I've identified and or presented in a different way than I might today, and you know that all of that is normal, right? And all of that is welcome. And so how do we make that space for folks so that they're not like looking at an intake form and being like female, male, other?
yes.
There's going to be a lot of people in that other box. And that's not a great place for us to land them, because we haven't actually had that curiosity about who they are at all by placing them in a box.
Yeah. And often the practitioner looks at it and just kind of skims over it and doesn't even bring it up. So why ask those questions, you know, if you're not going to bring it up? Yeah, it's just a whole other thing. So, Dr. Cyndi, I want to thank you again for sharing all of your info and all of your own lived experience and all of your knowledge. Don't forget her offer just in that offers tab there. She has uploaded it. All of her courses on her own Thinkific platform are there for you. Also that neutralizing clinical language PDF, free to use as necessary. So the link for that is there in the comments section. And I wanted to end, Dr. Cyndi, with one last question. And that is, what keeps you inspired?
Oh gosh, I think it's like, what keeps me inspired is like kind of two things. One is like people. And like it's mostly like my clients. It's the people who come to me, you know, like even like who find me randomly and they're like, you know what, I came to you because you actually wrote about being sex work positive on your website. And or I was looking for a healthcare provider who, you know, subscribes to the Health at Every Size and is like fat positive. And that's what inspires me, is that you know, that piece, it comes back to the like, how can I kind of create a little bit more health equity in my office, in my space, in my work? And if I can do that with one or two or more people, and the more people I can do it with, the better, the more inspired I am to continue to create change. And then the other piece is really like other people, not, you know, just like my clients, but other people doing this like amazing work in this space, you know, like I'm like, you know, I think about like being inspired by folks like Angela Davis or, and, you know, or like other folks who are like colleagues today, like you, or like I don't want to start naming people because I feel like I'm going to start like missing out on people who are really important to me. I would be horrible if I ever won an award for anything, but it's like all the people who keep this conversation going, who, are thinking through like, what does it mean to do things differently? What does it mean to like unlearn, or what might it mean to like create a new way of being in this space, or interacting with each other and interacting with ourselves, and how do we, create and co-create at the same time as dismantling. And that's the other piece that inspires me, right? I'm inspired by like land back activists and, folks doing things that like are not necessarily in the health sphere, but are so critical right now. Inspired by like fishers in Nova Scotia, and the big mud fishers like actually like, actively working on righting those relationships with the land and correcting land dispossession, that, that we can do things differently.
Wow. Beautifully said. Thank you so much again, Dr. Cyndi, for being here and just gracing us with your presence. It's always a pleasure. Thanks everyone for tuning in. And I've been so happy to just host you and listen and learn and provide that opportunity for others.
Yeah, thanks so much for having this conversation and creating the space for it. And hope that like folks kind of take something from today and run with it and make it their own and help change the world, because that's all we could do if we want to have hope.
Because we can change the world.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much again. Inspiring Insights happens every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Tune in for more. And I'm going to send everyone a replay of this beautiful webinar. So thank you all for coming, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Bye.